Over the centuries, the darkness of the crypts and the silence of the forests concealed a secret that the church preferred to bury rather than confront: the absolute dread of vampires. More than heresies, more than sorcery, even more than the devil himself, there was something about the dead who returned to drink the blood of the living that paralyzed faith and unsettled the clergy. But why? What made these creatures of the night more feared than the Prince of Hell? In an age when every inexplicable illness was seen as divine punishment and every shadow could conceal a servant of darkness, vampires represented a threat that transcended the spiritual. They violated the sacred order of death. They did not come merely to corrupt the soul. They came to devour the life, the flesh, and the peace of those left behind. In this video, we will exhume forgotten documents, prohibited legends, and secret rites that reveal how the church's fear of vampires shaped centuries of terror, hunts, and exorcisms. Prepare yourself for a journey where blood was the inverted sacrament and where coffins concealed something more terrifying than hell itself. At the turn of the first millennium, church bells rang not only to praise God, but also to ward off the dead who insisted on walking among the living. In the isolated villages of Eastern Europe, priests trembled more at a freshly disturbed grave than at a pentagram sketched on the floor. The vampire was not merely a legend, it was an everyday presence, a nightly terror murmured in confessionals and whispered between prayers. And this worried the church, not out of superstition, but because vampires represented a radical breach in the divine order. The devil, after all, had his place in the firmament of theology, rebel, enemy of God, but predictable in his nature. The vampire, on the other hand, was anomalous, a heresy of creation itself. The earliest ecclesiastical mentions of vampires do not appear in demonological treatises, but in papal bulls and inquisitorial records. The accounts were rife with panic. Corpses that would not rot, screams emanating from freshly sealed tombs, nocturnal apparitions of departed kin draining the vitality of the living. What terrified the clerics most was not merely the phenomenon, but the fact that, according to reports, blessings and sacraments seemed powerless against these creatures. Holy water dried up. Crucifixes failed to repel them. Exorcisms faltered. It was as if the vampire inhabited a limbo between the physical and the spiritual, flouting the rules that upheld the religious order of the world. Fear escalated with the rites of exhumation. When alleged vampires were dug up, bodies were found incorrupt, with fresh blood on their lips and skin still pink. These signs, far from being interpreted as miracles, were deemed proof of a curse. Church manuals instructed priests to carry out purification rituals involving decapitation, staking through the heart and, on occasion, the complete burning of the corpse. Communities often took part en masse in these events, experiencing a collective catharsis fueled by centuries of fear and ignorance, yet sanctioned by faith itself. There was a darker aggravating factor. Unlike the devil, who acted through temptation and seduction, the vampire invaded. It asked for no consent, forged no pacts, bargained for no souls. It simply seized, with a silent violence more terrifying than any demonic bargain. This posed a disturbing theological dilemma. How could one protect the flock from a wolf that the shepherd did not even recognize as part of the hierarchy of evil? The church's response was often silence or brutal repression, while in the margins of grimoires and the darkest sermons grew the fear that vampires were not only real, but a flaw in the divine blueprint, a fissure between worlds, an ancestral mistake that even the angels dared not touch. In certain regions of Wallachia and Transylvania, priests began to incorporate folk practices into religious rites in a desperate attempt to stem the advance of the undead. They mixed pagan symbols with Christian liturgy, buried suspected corpses with wild rose branches, placed blessed coins beneath their tongues, or sealed tombs with boards inscribed with psalms. Though on the fringes of orthodoxy, these practices were tolerated and sometimes encouraged by bishops and inquisitors who had witnessed too much to doubt. Fear spoke louder than doctrine. It was the silent realization that there was something lurking in the shadows of death that could not be explained simply by naming it Satan. In this first section, we see how the Church's fear of vampires went beyond popular superstition. It was rooted in the existential threat these entities posed to the very theological structure. They did not come from hell. They came from our world, and they intended to return. As the terror of vampires spread across medieval Europe, the Church began to grasp that it faced something deeper than mere local superstitions. Fear took shape in confessionals and gained momentum on the nights when bells tolled of their own accord, as if some invisible presence rang them. Theology possessed no defined category for the vampire. It was neither demon nor spirit. It was a post-mortem aberration, a condemned soul bound to flesh that, unlike ghosts, hungered and thirsted with physical desire. This made it a paradox. A dead being that violated eternal rest, an undead entity corrupting the cycle of divine creation. In obscure manuscripts discovered in remote abbeys, monks reported experiences bordering on cosmic horror. A 13th-century French abbot wrote of a body moving within its stone tomb, its lid creaking at midnight and exhaling a sweet, putrid breath. Another account from Bohemia told of a priest dragged into a crypt by a hooded figure whose faith was shattered when he witnessed the red eyes of a vampire weeping black tears. These were not mere legends but documented experiences, recorded with the anguish of those who had lost not only their peace, but their very belief. To the Church, vampires represented an ontological failure. God had created man, sin had brought death, and the devil offered eternal perdition. Everything was neatly in place. But the vampire did not fit. It emerged where it should not exist. More than heretical, it affronted the divine order, as if creation itself were being subverted by a primal force predating good and evil. And that force was contagious. Numerous letters exchanged between bishops warned of vampirism outbreaks in small communities where, after a suspicious death, others mysteriously fell ill at night, bearing marks on their necks and plagued by recurring nightmares. It was as though evil spread with the logic of disease, but both spiritual and physical. This contagion terrified the Church. Unlike the devil's temptations, which could be countered with penance, faith, and confession, vampirism eluded sacramental control. The Eucharist, symbolic of Christ's body and blood shared in communion, was mockingly mirrored by the vampire's profane communion, a solitary, bestial rite in which blood was taken by force, offering no redemption. In certain sermons, priests warned that the vampire was the inversion of Christ. Rather than laying down life for others, it stole life from others in order to remain dead. It was the anti-sacrament, anti-life. Fear intensified with rumors that some vampires had once been members of the clergy, corrupted monks, excommunicated bishops, priests who had committed suicide. It was believed that, having broken their vows and turned from the light, their souls could not find rest, and their sacrament-anointed bodies became perfect vessels for this curse. This created a silent panic among the faithful, who dreaded that spiritual corruption might manifest physically even after death. What if evil lurked not only outside the Church, but within its very walls? In response, secret orders and hidden confraternities sprang up within the Church itself. Specializing in restless dead, they studied forgotten rites and held nocturnal vigils in desecrated cemeteries. Operating in the shadows, often without the knowledge of the higher clergy, they comprised priests, monks, and even exorcists who believed that the battle against vampires required more than traditional doctrine. They wielded sacred relics, arcane symbols, and even adapted pagan sorcery. It was a silent, dirty war fought in the underbelly of medieval Christendom, far from the eyes of public faith. In this section, we delve deeper into how the figure of the vampire challenged the church's spiritual and philosophical structures. It was not merely an external foe, but an internal fissure, a presence threatening to corrupt even the pillars of belief. The vampire was the shadow the church could not explain, and therefore feared more than the devil himself. As vampiric terror swept across medieval Europe, the church realized it confronted something more profound than local superstition. Fear gained form in the confessionals and grew stronger on nights when church bells tolled as if touched by an unseen hand. Theology had no category for the vampire. It was neither demon nor spirit, but a post-mortem aberration, a condemned soul clinging to flesh that, unlike ghosts, thirsted for corporeal sustenance. This paradox, a dead being violating eternal rest, underscored the vampire's threat to divine order. In remote abbey manuscripts, monks recorded horrors verging on the cosmic. A French abbot of the mid-13th century described a corpse stirring within its stone sarcophagus, its lid creaking at midnight and exhaling a sweet, putrid breath. A Bohemian account told of a priest dragged into his crypt by a hooded figure, his faith shattered by the red glowing eyes of a vampire weeping black tears. These were not mere fables, but anguished testimonies from those who lost both peace and belief. For the church, vampires were an ontological aberration. God's creation placed man, sin brought death, and the devil offered eternal damnation. Each element held its rightful place. Yet the vampire did not fit this schema. It emerged where it should not exist, a heresy of creation. Worse still, it spread like a disease. Letters between bishops spoke of nights when, after a suspected vampiric death, others bore neck marks and nightmares, as if evil itself passed from victim to victim. Unlike the devil's temptations, which sacrament and penance could combat, the vampire defied sacramental power. Holy water dried up, crucifixes failed, and exorcisms faltered. It mocked the Eucharist, life's gift of Christ's body and blood, by its own beastly communion of bloodletting. Some sermons warned that the vampire was the antithesis of Christ. Instead of giving life, it stole it to remain dead, an anti-sacrament, anti-life. Rumors spread that some vampires had once served at the altar. Corrupted monks, excommunicated, bishops, priests driven to suicide. Having violated their vows, their sacrament-anointed bodies became ideal vessels for this unholy curse. The prospect that spiritual corruption could incarnate physically instilled silent panic among the faithful. Thus arose clandestine orders within the church, secret brotherhoods dedicated to combating the undead. Priests, monks, and exorcists, often unknown to official hierarchy, studied forbidden rites, wielded relics, and even adapted pagan incantations. In the hidden crypts and cemeteries, they waged a covert war to protect the living. Over the centuries, as the Inquisition gained strength and church structures solidified, vampire fear did not vanish, but transformed. Whispered in Latin, concealed in demonological treatises and margin glosses in theological manuscripts, the vampire became studied not just as an aberration, but as a symptom, a dark reflection of Christianity's doctrinal failures. Theologians began to see in vampires evidence that sin did not die with the body, but could take root in flesh after death, a living heresy pulsing in the catacombs' silence. Official theology, fearing scandal, preferred to ignore or reinterpret these reports. Yet, in secret correspondence, learned priests exchanged ciphered letters discussing containment methods, village reports, and even taxonomy of vampire types. A 15th century Italian manuscript classified vampires into two principal kinds: those who returned by desire and those by curse. The former, driven by obsessive love or vengeance, retained some conscience and could be pacified by ritual. The latter, puppets of primordial evil, soulless and driven only by hunger and decay, resisted all rites, recoiling only from fire or intense light. In heavily afflicted regions, the Church instituted specific ecclesiastical roles: watchers of the dead, priests tasked with inspecting cemeteries for post-mortem signs of unrest. Lanterns in hand, rosaries and wooden stakes at the ready, they whispered prayers and scanned the earth for movement. Legends said vampires could scent faith itself, and sometimes murmured names in moonless nights, names of priests, of children, of the forgotten. Secret inverted cemeteries also appeared, where corpses were buried head down, stones on their chests and mouths sewn shut to prevent their return. Although clandestine, these practices were quietly tolerated by local hierarchies. So persistent were the reports of apparitions, sudden deaths, and shared nightmares. A 1612 Polish case tells of a village where 3 children died in succession after dreaming of a gray-skinned woman with white eyes. Exhumation revealed a nun excommunicated 2 decades earlier, her nails grown long and dried blood in her teeth. The tomb was sealed with salt, crucifixes and fire, yet fear never left that land. Perhaps most alarming was the rise of dissident sects within Christianity that venerated vampires as emissaries of forbidden truth. To them, vampires proved life beyond death without divine grace, a hidden cycle, a secret kept by men of faith. Brutally hunted, these groups nevertheless left deep scars. Some whispered that fallen monasteries concealed crypts where renegade monks kept vampires as prisoners, studying them for the key to immortality. They claimed the Church knew and chose silence over admitting doctrinal gaps. This ambivalent interplay of faith and terror culminated in disturbing artworks portraying vampires not as grotesque monsters, but as angelic figures in clerical vestments, eyes sad and mouths stained with blood. These images blended ecstasy and repulsion, sacred and profane, vampires as inverted mirrors of sanctity, those who die but do not depart, who suffer but do not redeem, who live only to destroy. Ultimately, what terrified the Church most was familiarity. Vampires did not come from without, but emerged from within Christendom itself, born of a flawed judgment, of a sacrament misplaced, of a soul faith failed to save. They were the fruit of a broken promise, that death brings peace. When that promise failed, only horror remained. As we consider these legends and documents today, we ask, what truly terrorized the Church? Was it the blood, the screams, the incorrupt corpses? Or the possibility that despite all faith, some forces lie beyond its control? Perhaps vampires were never the real enemy, but the mirror faith dreaded to face. If this tale has sent chills down your spine and sparked your curiosity for history's hidden shadows, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with fellow lovers of forgotten legends until our next descent into the darkness of history.